In this tutorial, I'll quickly give you an overview of the most important features in Next.js. So it's actually a really exciting time to learn Next.js because the latest app router is a game changer for web development. You can now build full stack applications with just React. You don't need a separate backend anymore. So I have identified these 12 concepts as the most important concepts that you need to know. And I have created a simple demo project here, which showcases all of the main features in practice. Now I will go through it very fast. So if something is unclear, that's totally fine. This is just meant as a quick overview of all the main concepts. But how do we even create a new Next.js application? Well, I just created a simple folder here called example, and I've opened that up in my code editor here, and it's currently empty. And you can run npx create next app. And if you want the latest one, you can say add latest. Now, when you do this, it will actually create a new folder in here, but I just created an empty folder for my project. So I just wanted to just put all the files directly in this folder. So then you can put a period in here. It's going to ask me a bunch of questions. And here it will guide you through a setup. I just go with the default. So yes, I want to use TypeScript, ESLint, Tailwind CSS is the default as you can see in Next.js. Would you like to use the source directory? And actually, yes, I would like that. And of course, we want to use the app router before we had the pages router. And we don't want to customize the default import. So this is so that you don't have that // in those import file paths. And this is going to be a Next.js boilerplate. All right, I'll quickly run this as well so we can see what this gives us. Alright, so now our app is running here. This is the default boilerplate that you get. So this is actually the home page, and you can find that here in the source directory and then in the app directory, and that's going to be this page.tsx file. We'll talk more about that in a second. But here you can see there's usually a big file here, a bunch of boilerplates here. I don't really like it that they have so much boilerplate. And typically one of the first things you're going to do is you're just going to remove all of this boilerplate here, all of this markup, because we don't want to have this homepage. We want to have our own homepage, of course. And this is all styling from Tailwind CSS, which we will also quickly talk about later. And we can also remove this. So typically one of the first things you're going to do is just remove a bunch of boilerplates. So then here in layout, this is the root component. We'll talk all about this in a second, but basically all of your pages are going to be the children here, and they're going to be wrapped by this body tag. You can see the default font is the Inter font, which I like, it's a nice font, professional font. We also have some metadata here. And it's actually also linking to a CSS file. So if we go into that CSS file, you can see there are also some default styles here. So we do need to keep these if we want to use Tailwind, but the rest I typically also just delete. Now we will have a blank page essentially. And this is what you're going to get with a fresh install of Next.js. So routing and navigation. So here I'm on the home page and I can click on posts here and I will go to /post. So how do you do that in Next.js? So we're going to have a source directory here, and then in there we will have an app directory. And in here you basically determine all of the routes of your application. So here in the root, you're going to have this page.tsx file. That's going to be for the home page. So if I open that up, you can see in this component, I just have a bunch of markup here. Now we want to have a /posts route. So what you do is you go into the app directory, and if you want to have /posts in the URL, you need to create a folder actually called post, and then you have another page.tsx file. So we have the home page and the posts page, but what about the individual posts? Because we could have thousands of posts, and what we want is something like posts / and then maybe the ID of the posts, right? Maybe 8,400 something. So then should we create a folder for each one of those paths? And the answer is no. So you can just create one, and this is a dynamic route as it's called. You write that in square brackets. So here, whatever it may be, that's going to be here for this ID route. And then you can have another page for that, right? So then here, if I click here, for example, on this one, this has an ID of 1, and that will come from this page.tsx, right? And then if I go back and if I click on another one, this one has an ID of 2, and this will use the same page.tsx file, right? So this is called a dynamic route. So here we have the pages, and if I make this a little bit wider, you can see that I have restricted the width of this. And what you will also see is that whenever I navigate between the home and the post route, there is a header and footer, and they stay the same. Well, that's what you would do in the layout file. So the layout file here, this is going to be the root of your application. So this is where it all starts essentially. So here we have a so-called root layout, and then you have children in there. So these are going to be the page, right? So this is going to be the home page. If I go to posts, this is going to be the post. And you can see that on top of there, we have this header component, and below there we have a footer component. So every page will essentially be sandwiched between this header and footer. And then I also have this container to restrict the width on every page. If we look at the header, you can see I have 2 links there, and I can click them to navigate. I'm using the built-in link component in Next.js. This will essentially just render an anchor tag on the page. And so traditionally with an anchor tag, if you would use that, you would basically get a whole new page. However, with the Next.js link component, you will not send a new request to the server. Next.js will manage all of the routing here client side. And in production, this link will also prefetch the page when when it's in view. Next.js also makes it really easy to deal with metadata in your project. So here by default in the layout file, you can configure the metadata right here. So the title is what you will see here in the tab, and that's also what you will see in the Google search rankings. If you only have this one in the layout file, this will be global for your entire app. If you want to override it on some page, you can export the same variable, so also an export const metadata, and then just set a title specific for that page. So then we get to styling. You can see that I'm using all of these class names, and they don't come from me, they actually come from Tailwind CSS. It is the default in Next.js when you create a new application. Now Next.js does give you this globals.css file as well, and here you can also write CSS like before. So the main benefit of using Tailwind CSS is that you don't have to come up with a separate class name, because traditionally what you would have to do to style this h1, for example, you would have to give this a class name, let's call it first heading, and now I would have to select it here, and that's how you would style this traditionally. Now the downside of this is that every time you want to style some element, you have to be creative and you have to come up with a class name here. How would I call it? First heading, or maybe just heading, or maybe heading dash first, right? So you have to be creative with these class names, and then you have to go to a separate file to style it. So you also have context switching. So Tailwind CSS solves those problems. If I remove this, so here I can just use classes from Tailwind. I can set the font size like this. I can set the font weight. If I now save here, you can see this also works, but I don't have to come up with some clever class name, and I don't have to go to a separate file. And before we continue, I quickly want to talk about today's sponsor, which is Hostinger. Now by the end of the video, I will actually show you how you can deploy your Next.js application to Hostinger. They're running a massive Black Friday sale right now. So if you go to hostinger.com/ByteGrad, you will be able to find this promotion, and they've even given us an additional discount code so you can deploy and host your Next.js applications for a very affordable price. So here they show you the options you have, and for example for their KVM2 plan, they are offering this for only $7 a month, right? So you're getting at 8 GB of RAM, 100 GB of disk space. This should be more than enough for multiple Next.js apps, even if you're including the database with them with, for example, SQLite. So if you're already a little bit more advanced and you know about hosting and setting up a VPS, you may also want to consider hosting your Next.js app on a VPS. So the 12 months and 24 months are very attractive prices right now. Now it gets even more attractive because if we scroll down here, you will also be able to add my coupon code. So if you go here and you type ByteGrad, you can apply that and you get an even more attractive price. So if you're familiar with VPS hosting, then check out this deal for your Next.js applications. So Next.js also offers an out-of-the-box image component, and I'm using that here in the header for the logo. I actually wrapped it with a link component as well, so then when you click the image, you can go back to the homepage. Now this image component will actually just render an image in the HTML. If you have a PNG image, for example, that's a very heavy image because it's not compressed. However, with Next.js, it can automatically serve a WebP version of that. This image component will also help you make the image responsive because it will set the source set and some other attributes as well. Also, sometimes with images, especially if it's a big one, it may shift content around, right? So if I had a big image here, this may already be displayed, but then the image comes in and shifts everything down, right? It's called content layout shift, or CLS, and it's one of the metrics that Google looks at when ranking your website. So this image component also helps you out with that. It can do it automatically if you have your image right here in the file system, and what it will do is it will just set the width and height of that image, or if it's an external image, right here I'm linking to an external image, you have to set the width and height yourself to prevent that layout shift. Now I'm using an external image here, meaning the domain name here is different from my own website, and Next.js will not automatically allow you to do that. So you need to go into the next configuration file, next.config, and here you need to specify for images that you explicitly want to allow images from this host name. If I comment this out and save, now I will get an error, invalid source prompt. So it doesn't allow me to just use any external image in my app. I have to make it explicit that I want to allow images from this host name. This is for extra security. So then we get to client and server components. This is also a major innovation. So previously, if you're using Feed, everything is a client component. All the components, all their code is shipped to the client, and those components run on the client in the browser. However, these days we also have a server component. So these components only run on the server, and that has certain benefits. So the Next.js team recommends that now when you make a GET request to fetch data, that you do that in a server component. So here on the posts page, here we are in a server component because everything by default in the app directory is a server component. And all of these pages therefore are also a server component. And what you can do in a server component is you can just make a fetch call without use effect fact, just directly here in the component function body, I can just make a fetch call to some dummy JSON website to get some dummy data here. It will give me a response. I can get the data here and I can just pass that to another component. Now this component can then be a client component. So what would happen is that Next.js behind the scenes will make sure that this data goes from the server to the client. Now the benefit of fetching here on the server in a server component is that this can be closer to the actual data source. So if we have a database somewhere in the world, we can make it so that this fetch happens close to that database. Another benefit of server components is that we can keep large dependencies on the server only. If you're using a third party that is pretty heavy, for example this syntax highlighter, this is a big dependency, it's a big third party package. So you may have some code block that you want to style, right? So here maybe on every page we want to have some code block and I just have some dummy text here. And the syntax highlighter will just add some colors for that code, right? That's called syntax highlighting and it's similar to what I have in my code editor actually, right? So you can see the return keyword has a reddish color here, right? That's syntax highlight so that we can easily see what the code does, basically just adding some colors. But this is a third party component and it's huge, but it's not a problem because this is a server component. So this will only stay on the server and the result of this render output will be sent to the client only, not all of the dependencies here, right? So on the client, this component won't need to render. It can already be rendered on the server with the syntax highlighting and the result of that will be given to the client. So if I go to this page right now, if I refresh here, you can see I have 8.2 megabytes of resources on this page. So this syntax highlighter is not shipped to the client right now, but what if we make this a client component? And we can do that by simply adding use client at the top. So now that this is a client component, this rendering will happen on the client. And to make that rendering happen, well, it needs this dependency. So now if I refresh, you can see we're getting 12.5 megabytes of resources, right? That's much more than before. If I comment this, right? So now if I save here and if I refresh, we're getting 8.2 megabytes of resources. So this is one more benefit of server components. You can keep large dependencies on the server and there are other benefits as well. So then we get to server actions and maybe this is even the biggest innovation in Next.js. So we can do our get requests in server components, but what about those other requests, those post, put and delete requests? And for these requests, we can now use server actions. So with server actions, we're trying to replace those post, put and delete requests. So what I did here is I just added this form on this posts route so we can actually submit a new post here. And I also added a database, so I'm getting all the posts from my database here in posts, and that's what I'm passing here to this post list. Right, so before I had a fetch call here to just some dummy JSON, but I can also just interact with my own database in a server component. Right, I'm using Prisma here as my so-called ORM, don't worry, I'll explain everything. And it will just get all of the posts out of my database, and it will still pass that here to posts list. So there are already 3 posts in the database, and that's what we're just getting from the database and just passing to posts list here. But now I added this add post form, that's what we see here, to add a new post. So if I go there, if I just scroll down for now, you can see the markup here is pretty standard, but there is one special thing here, which is that for the action attribute here, we have passed an add post function. And that's actually a so-called server action. So if we scroll up here, you can define that here in the function component body, or you can put it in a separate file. So this function is just a function, just like any other function, except you add use server at the top. So this function will only run on the server. And what you also get here is the form data. So if you pass a function here, Next.js will automatically give the form data to that function. So you don't have to collect the form information yourself anymore. And what we're doing here is we're creating a new post in our database from that form data. We'll talk more about how Prisma works and how all of that works with databases. Right, so what we can do now is I can say test for the title, and let's say body is also test. And now if I click on submit new post, well, we don't see anything happen, but if I now refresh, you can see that at the bottom we actually have a new post now. And before I would have to create like a /API route, and we would do something like on submit, and then you would have handle submit. And in that handle submit, you would have to do e.prevent default to prevent that weird submission that the browser does when you submit a form. You would need to get the form data, or maybe you have the form data in state. And then you had to create a whole separate /API/post to just send the data to some route. And then you would have to create that actual route handler. And then in there, you could actually add it to the database. So this way, client and server were 2 very separate things. And you had to do a lot of work to cross that boundary of going from client to server. Well, now that boundary has been abstracted away by Next.js with these server actions. So I don't have to create a whole separate /API route. I can just create a normal JavaScript function and I can mark it with use server, so it only runs on the server. And Next.js will make sure that the data from this form on the client will be sent to the server and specifically to this function, which will then add it to the database. And there are many other benefits of this. For example, I had to refresh to see the new post, right? But here it gets even cooler, because what you can also do is use revalidate path after you did the update in the database. What we're specifying here is that after this update in the database, we want to basically re-render this post's route, right? So that's this component. So this component will be re-rendered, and so it will get all of the new posts from the database. And we just added this one here. So then it should get the new one as well. So I will say another testing. Now if I click on submit new post, you can see that immediately, or very quickly at least, because it's all local here, it gets added to the list. I don't have to refresh. So what happens actually is this component gets re-rendered, and the result of this will be streamed into our application here, and that will contain the new post without any refresh. And if we want to add a loading indicator, well, that's very easy to do as well. So here we have a submit button. We get a hook here from React, but it works in Next.js, called use form status. So here we can see if it's pending or not. Basically, is there a server action running here? And this needs to be a client component. So we have marked this as use client. And then what we can do here is we can disable this button when it's pending. When it's submitting, we can say it should be disabled because we don't want the user to submit it twice. And then with Tailwind, it's actually super easy. We can select this element in the disabled state. So when it's disabled, give it a bit of a lighter background color. So if I now try this again, if I say very cool, and then I say yes, and now if I click submit new post, and that was a little bit too fast, so I'm going to slow down the server action a little bit. So here I'm just going to make it wait for 2 seconds, right? So this will just wait 2 seconds before it continues here. So now let me try this again, another try. Yep. So now if you take a look, if I click here, you can see we have this loading indicator, and after 2 seconds, it automatically updates the UI as well, right? So server actions, including the hooks that work with them, are in my opinion the biggest innovation in Next.js. And by the way, we practice with them a lot in my React and Next.js course. So I have a complete course on React and Next.js. Highly recommend you check it out if you want to become a professional React or Next.js developer. All right, so then we get to suspense and streaming, and this sounds very complicated, but it has to do essentially with loading. So now I'm here on the homepage. If I click on posts now, you can see it takes a little bit. It needs to fetch all of the posts, right? So if we go here to the post page, it needs to fetch all of these posts from the database, and we're awaiting that, and only then will it return all of this, right? And it's the same when I go to an individual blog post, right? So if I click on, let's say this number 4 test, you can see I click now, but now I had to wait a little bit, and while I was waiting, I didn't see any loading indicator. So what I can do is I can add back my loading.tsx file, and this is also a special file, just like page.tsx is a special file, loading.tsx is also a special file, because what you're telling Next.js is basically this is what you want to have as a fallback while something is loading. So if we add this here, and now I go back, and you can see now when I go to post, you can see there was a loading indicator there. If I go to any of these individual blog posts, you can see there's also going to be a loading indicator there. So this is what you want to use most of the time when you have some kind of async await. You're awaiting some asynchronous action. Usually that means data fetching, and you want to show some kind of loading indicator. What does that have to do with suspense and with streaming? If you add that loading.tsx file, for example, here we added at the same level as this page.tsx file for /post. Well, what Next.js will do behind the scenes, it will take that posts page and it will wrap that in a suspense component, and the fallback will be that actual loading file, right? So this is actually a React feature, but Next.js abstracts this away for you with this loading.tsx file. One downside of this is if I go to posts here, the whole page will now be blocked, because if I look here, we are fetching the posts only for this component here, right? And we're awaiting that, and while this is going on, we will see that loading indicator, but that also means that we don't see this h1 all posts. So when you go to that route, you will not immediately see all posts. And let me actually show that even better by just adding some delay here as well of just 1 second, right? So this will just add 1 extra second in waiting. So now if I go to post, you can see it's just loading everything here. It's blocking everything. We only need the data here for this component. Everything else will also be invisible until until that is complete, until we actually get the data, even though we don't need the data for this H1. And I think this is not a good user experience, because if they go to this page, I immediately want to show this H1 to them so that they know they're on the right page. But now we're not going to see this H1 because of getting all of that data from the database is blocking everything on the page. And maybe we have other components down here as well that have nothing to do with these posts, but they would also be blocked. We would not see them until this getting data from our database has been complete. So what we could do is we could move this getting data or fetching data, we can move it out of this component, and we could actually also just move it down into this posts list component itself, right? So just to quickly show you how that would look like, right? It's just the exact same. This is also a server component, so we can do that, no problem, right? And now we can remove the props because it won't receive these as props anymore. I can remove all of this and I will just import this. So now it just fetches the posts itself. So we don't need to pass the posts down here. Okay. And now what I can do is I can remove that loading.tsx file as well. Okay, so I just removed the loading.tsx file, but we were using that so we could show a loading indicator while there was some data fetching going on, right? But we didn't want to show the loading indicator for the whole page. We only want to show it for this post list component. So you can actually also yourself manually wrap this in a suspense, right? This is just a component, and you can just put that post list component in there because this is an asynchronous component and it will be suspended basically until that is resolved. And until it has been resolved, until the data fetching has been complete, we can show a fallback, right? We can just say loading ... So now if I go to homepage here and now I go to post, you can see all posts immediately rendered on the page, and a little bit later we see the post list. But now it's not blocking the entire page, right? So if I refresh here, we're just going to show loading ... initially. And when this is complete and this has been resolved, the result of this will be streamed in, right? So we don't have to do a refresh or anything. Next.js will make sure that when this render is finally finished, it will just be streamed in, right? And that's basically suspense and streaming, right? So I think that's pretty cool, pretty innovative as well. Now I will quickly undo this and I will just stick to the loading.tsx file for this tutorial. All right, so then we get to caching, which is closely related to static and dynamic rendering. So what does all of that mean? So by default, Next.js actually pretty aggressively caches your application, and it's probably the most complex topic in Next.js. So this looks very intimidating, but you don't need to understand this right now. This will come with a lot of experience, and building Next.js applications, you will build an intuition for which cache you're interacting with. By the way, I'm getting all of these infographics from the Next.js documentation. Now to give you some intuition here for caching, I just changed this back to making a fetch call to the dummy JSON. So if we say limit is 5, we will just get 5 blog posts. For example, here when I go to post, you can see there's a loading indicator initially. But what if I now go back to the home page and now I click on the forward button again, you can see it's instant. There was no loading indicator, right? So if I go back and forth, it's just instant. It doesn't have to send a request to the server and then run the server component again, fetch the data again. There is already a client-side cache here in the browser managed by Next.js called the router cache, which will make sure that you have instant back and forth button. Now it's not cached forever. So by default, this will only be cached for 5 minutes. That client-side cache will also be gone if you just refresh here. So now if I go back, you can see there's a loading indicator again. So that's all client-side, but Next.js also manages 2 caches on the server. So to show you that, so here right now, it's always fetching 5 blog posts, right? So that's what we see here. If I refresh, it's always 5 blog posts. Now to showcase those 2 caches that you will get on the server, let's actually make that a random amount of blog posts. This will just give us a random number between 0 and 10. So then we can use this as the limit here. And I'm actually adding +1 at the end here. So it's always going to be at least 1. So now it's going to be between 1 and 10. So now if I refresh here, you will see that every time I refresh, or almost every time, it will have a different amount of blog posts that we are fetching here, right? So here, there's always a different amount, which proves that every time I go there, this component is rendering, right? Because otherwise it would stay the same. When I go there, it's running. When I refresh again, it's running again. So this is called dynamic rendering, which basically means there is no caching here because it's rendering every time I make a request, right? So that is dynamic rendering. Now that is only during development, right? So development is when you do npm run dev. So in Next.js, when you do a clean install, you're going to get a couple of scripts here. So these 3 are the most important here. So most of of the time you're going to use this one to spin up a dev server and do development, but eventually you want to run a build to optimize everything, right? Minify your project, make it as small as possible, as performant as possible, and the result of that build is what you will actually use in production. Now you can run that build here locally. I can just say npm run build, and this will give me the result of a build here somewhere in the file system. And if I quickly want to run that build here just in my own browser, I can use this one. Now this is relevant because here when we go to the posts page, this is dynamically rendered, but when you go to production, Next.js will make this statically rendered. So basically it will be cached. So let me prove that to you. I'm going to run that build. I'm going to say npm run build, and then it's finished, and it will actually give you some information here. So you can see here at the bottom it says static, and it's saying something pre-rendered as static content. So here you can see in that final build, which we by the way have in our file system here, if I scroll up, you can see .next. So here it will have the result of that build. And what do we have in there? Well, Next.js will tell us. So we have the homepage route. It will by default also create some underscore not found route. And then we have our posts route. And then we also have our post with the dynamic ID route, right? So Next.js has really been built around a route, right? So before maybe you had a mindset of components. When you get to Next.js, you need to get more into the mindset of route. So here we see that they also have different symbols here. So we can see that the empty circle here is a so-called static route, which means that during this build, Next.js was already creating the result of this, right? So during the build, it was running this component, and the result of that will simply be served every time. That's what it means when it's pre-rendered as static content. So it will not run whenever you go there. It will only run once here during the build. And now when I go there, so let's actually spin up our server again, but this time with that build, so npm run start. So now when I go to my /post, right, so now I'm running the production build, and in this component, remember, we're getting a random number and then we're fetching a random amount of blog posts. So what you would expect maybe is that when I refresh here, that every time it would be different, but no, it's actually the same every time I refresh, right? You can see I keep refreshing here, it's always the same, because Next.js will just render that route, basically just this component here, including child components. It will just render all of that once during the build, and the result of that will be served whenever you go there. It will not be re-rendered here, right? So in production, this is going to be static. During development, it was dynamic. So whenever you make a request, it was running all of this again. But what if we also want to run it every time in production? Well, what you can do is you can go here and you can say for this route, you can export a const. It's called dynamic. And you can say this route also needs to be dynamic, force it to be dynamic. So now if I save here, now I have to rebuild, as it's called, right? So npm run build. And now when I look at the result of this build, you can see we now have this lambda icon for the /posts route as well. So let's actually run this. Okay, let's try it out. Now if I refresh, you can see every time I'm refreshing here, it's getting new posts. Now it's completely dynamic, which means every time you make a request, it's going to render that component. And that's going to be true for everything in this route now. So with this setting, we're setting it for the entire route. So also child components here, they will now also be dynamically rendered every time you make a request. So if you want to be a little bit more granular, you can say for this fetch call only this one should be dynamic. So you can actually go into this fetch call and you can specify here something. This is not something you can do outside of Next.js. And what we can say here is actually cache, no cache, right? So that's how you can opt out of that aggressive caching that Next.js does. But for this use case, for a website like this, I would actually use the cache, because for posts, well, this is not going to change very often. We may add a post at some point, but most of the time this can just stay the same. There's no need to re-render everything here. So I wouldn't use cache, no cache here. I would just keep it statically rendered, which means every time we go there it will be the same. But what about when we actually do have a new post and it actually should show that new post? Well, you can also specify something else here. So here next, and then we can say revalidate. So with this option, it means it should be cached, right? So every time I will refresh, it should just be the same. But after 1 hour, right, so 3600 seconds, it actually should fetch new data again, right? So after 1 hour, if you then make a request, it will actually re-render and it will actually make a new fetch call. So on the server side, there are actually two caches. So here we make this fetch call, and the result of that will be stored in a so-called data cache. And then there is also the full route cache. So basically all the components of this route here will be rendered, and the result of that will be cached on the server as well. So caching and this static and dynamic rendering, these are the two most complex topics in Next.js. So I don't expect you to completely understand this right. We do practice with this in my course as well. So then we get to middleware. So middleware is something that you can run before the request hits the server. So for example, if I refresh here, there will be a request to the server. And right before that request hits the server, we can already run some code, maybe check if the user is logged in. So you can create a middleware.ts file, and this needs to be directly here in the root of the app directory. And this would be an example. So here you can export a function, we can call that middleware, and it will get that request. Right? So middleware allows you to hook into that incoming request before it touches anything else on the server. You can quickly run some code. So here you get the request, and we can type this as a next request. And the most common use case for middleware is authentication. So here we can check if the user is authenticated. Right? So here I hardcode false, but in the real world you may want to use next auth, or what I recommend is actually a third party for authentication. You can use something like kind to deal with authentication. So then you will get some result. If the user is not authenticated, you can redirect them, and otherwise you can just let the request continue. And you can also match for which routes it needs to run this. Maybe not for all routes, but maybe only the dashboard and the account pages should be protected. Now I quickly sneaked in number 11 here because I also quickly want to give you an overview of a typical folder structure in the modern Next.js app. So if I open up my sidebar here, so this is an example of a full stack application because I'm also using a database with Prisma. So what you see here is always a bunch of configuration files. Usually they have pretty strange names like .eslint, rc.json. They are often also in different formats, right? So this is in JSON format, .gitignore is a different format. This one is in JavaScript format. This one is TypeScript. So a bunch of configuration essentially. Then we have a public folder. So here's where you could use images, static files that you could reference in your code, but not a fav icon. So if you want to use a fav icon, you can go into source app, and here you can actually just create a file called favicon.ico, and Next.js will actually use that file as your fav icon. So here by default you actually get the Vercel logo. So this is another special file, and there are other special files as well that we have not seen here yet, like a robot.txt file. You can just add that here in the app directory and Next.js will pick that up. Other special files are, for example, error.tsx. So here we have loading, but maybe there's also an error. There's also a special not found file here in Next.js. This can be useful, for example, here on the ID page. Here on the individual block page, what we are doing here is we're trying to get this ID from the URL, and Next.js will actually give us that here in param. So with these page components, you get params because here we have square brackets ID, and then in there you can get the ID. Right? So it's called params.id because we called that ID here in the folder. So you can get whatever you put here in there, and then we can actually fetch the post that is of that ID. Now here in the real world, of course, what people could do is they could put in some gibberish here, and if it does not exist, this API will still return an object, but it won't have a title, it won't have an ID. So here we can just check if it doesn't have a title, we know that there is no related post found here. So what you can actually call is a not found function from Next.js, which will automatically show this component. So if I do this, I press enter here, you can see the post was not found, right? So there are these special little files that come in quite handy. So that was a lot to take in. Don't worry if something is unclear, that's totally normal because it's just a quick overview. Now I do want to mention I have a complete course on React and Next.js in which we will also build some really nice projects, including one that's actually quite similar to this one. So if you want to see how all of this fits together in a real world application, you want to see how it's built from absolute scratch, then highly recommend you check out that course, links in the description. So we have to talk about a production build and the options you have for deploying. So first of all, what you could do is you could take the entire app and just create a bunch of HTML, CSS and JavaScript files from that. This is called a static export, and you can do that by going to the next configuration file. You only have to specify output is export. Now when you do a static export, you're going to lose a bunch of server-side features. So one of them is actually this image optimization. So when you do this, you will get an error because we're using the image component, or you need to make it explicit that you will just say unoptimized true. And now when you run this build command, what we've seen before, you will get a new next folder here, which will have an HTML file for each route, and it will have some CSS and JavaScript files. So just a static asset that you can host anywhere you want. There will not be some server in the background servicing requests. So that's something that you could do, but you lose a lot of those benefits that you get with Next.js, right? So things like server components and server actions will not work the same. So instead, we do want to have a server running in the background, a Node.js server. So typically you don't want to do this, and we do want to optimize images. Now for hosting, it may be good to know that your Next.js application is actually just a Node.js app. So anywhere where you can run Node.js, you should also be able to run a Next.js application. Now, if you're a total beginner, you may just want to go with one of the managed platforms like Vercel. These are the popular options. Now, those managed platforms typically do come at a higher price, especially as you start to scale. So if you're already a little bit more advanced and you know about hosting and setting up a VPS, you may also want to consider hosting your Next.js app on a VPS. Now, whatever option you pick for deploying, typically you do want to push it to GitHub first. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a GitHub repo here. I'm going to say new repo. I will call that cool app, let's say. I will make it public, and then I'm going to create the repo. So now it's ready for us to push there. Now, before we actually push to GitHub, I do quickly want to talk about environment variables. So if we look at the .env here, I only have this one, and this is what you're going to need if you're using something like Prisma. And this is simply necessary for Prisma to work. Now, this is not really a secret, so it's not really a problem if somebody else sees this, but we still have it as an environment variable, and we also need this in production. So this actually needs to be included in our repository. So when I push to GitHub, this actually should be included. Now, if you have some information that actually should be a secret, Next.js recommends that you create a .env.local file. And this is where you would actually put your secrets. And you can also see that this file name is grayed out. And that's because by default in the .getignore that you get when creating a new Next.js application, .env.local is already included here. Right, so it's important that you understand environment variables. So we also talk a lot about this in my course. And let me close this as well. Another thing that I want to do here also has to do with the database, which is when we are going to run a build, we also need to configure something here for Prisma. So we need to say Prisma db push, and then it can actually build it, right? But this is all database Prisma stuff. You don't have to understand this right now. So now we're ready to push this to GitHub. Now it's good to mention when you create a new Next.js application with create next app, it will actually already initialize a Git repository here for your project. So you don't have to run Git init because it's already been initialized. So we just want to add everything. So you can just do git add and then git commit. And actually we can just copy all of this in one go and just paste that in one go. And then when I go back here, we should see our code. So you can see now our code is on GitHub as well, including this .env file, which holds an environment variable, which is not really a secret, and not the .env.local file, right? So that's actually how we want this to work. And now we can decide where we actually want to host this. Now, if you're a beginner, you may just want to stick to the popular managed platforms like Vercel. But if you're already a little bit more experienced and you know about servers and you know about maybe VPS, then I recommend you check out the Hostinger deal. So I'm going to show you how to deploy this to the Hostinger VPS, and it's going to be much easier than you think. So when you buy a VPS, you'll go through an onboarding process. Let me quickly show you how that works. You can just start here and you can pick a location for the VPS. So it's actually a Lithuanian company, so maybe that's why they put it at the top. But what I usually do is just pick the United States, and then you get an option for how you want to configure the operating system. So they actually do have some default configurations here under applications. So you can actually just install this with Ubuntu and Node.js, which may be something you want to do because Next.js is actually just a Node.js application. However, I will go back here. You may also want to pick a plain OS with no control panel, but I'm actually going to go with this one. With the control panel, you will be able to manage multiple applications or multiple sites a bit easier. So I'm going to go with Cloud Panel here and Ubuntu. So I'm going to click continue here. I'm not going to install anything in addition right now. And we need to set a password for that control panel if you want to use that control panel, which we're not going to do in this video, but that may be something you want to do if you have multiple applications on the VPS. So I just typed in my panel password. I'm just going to continue here. All right, so then this is another important part. Here we need to set up a password so that we can SSH into our VPS, right? So that's how you will access your VPS. Okay, so I just added a password. I'm going to continue here and we get a nice overview, and now we're going to finish the setup. Now it will take a couple of minutes. All right, so after some time, it's ready, it's finished. We can immediately buy a domain or you can buy it later. All right, so then we have our VPS information right here, and they will also give you this IP address, which we will use to connect to our VPS as well as when we go to the browser to visit our application. Right now nothing is there, so let's change that. We need to log into our VPS with SSH to change things. So here we have SSH access, and here they show you what you can type in the terminal. We need to run this in a shell or terminal. So in Visual Studio Code, you actually have an integrated terminal here, right? So Visual Studio Code is not just a code editor, they actually also put a terminal in there. And if I kill this, you can see for me, it's the Z shell because I'm on Mac. On Windows, this is going to be PowerShell or CMD, the command prompt, but all the commands that we're going to run, it's all the same. But here you can see Visual Studio Code is not just a code editor, it's an IDE, it's a fancy word, integrated development environment. So there's much more than just code code editing. Now for actually setting up our VPS, I tried running all the commands in here, but I run into issues when I do it here in Visual Studio Code. So I have opened up this standalone terminal here, and on Windows you can also just open up a standalone PowerShell. So I'm going to type SSH and then it's root at and then it's the IP address. So I'll press enter here. So here we have an additional security question. I will just say yes. All right, so then we need to pass the password that we set up earlier. So this needs to be the password, not for your panel, but the password that you passed for SSH access. All right, so I typed it, although you can't see that here, it's hidden, but I will press enter here. And I mistyped, so maybe I should try again. So I just typed it, I'm gonna press enter. And finally, we are logged in, and you're gonna see something about Cloud Panel because I picked that panel. If you didn't pick that, you're not gonna see that. All right, but now what I can do is I can say present working directory. I'm in the root of this VPS, and I can check the files in here. And we wanna run our app. Now our app is actually a Node.js app, so we do need Node.js. If I try typing Node V, you'll see that Node.js is actually not installed here. And we will also need a Git. So if I type Git, you can see Git is actually pre-installed here, so that's nice. So what we're going to do is I will first just install npm. So we can say apt install npm, the Node package manager. All right, so now we have npm. I can say npm-v. Now we can install something globally called n, just the character n, and this will allow us to then easily install Node.js and install specific versions. So you can actually just type n latest. Okay, so now if I type node-v, so now we want to run our Next.js app here on this VPS. We will not run npm run dev, but we will run npm run start, but it will also give you localhost port 3000, right? But that will be on the VPS. So what we want to do is when we just go to our IP here, right? So when you type this in the address bar, what we should do is it should route that internally to localhost 3000 where our Next.js app is running. So to route the traffic, we're going to use nginx. If we actually say nginx and check the version, you can see it's actually pre-installed. All right, so I just made this terminal a little bit bigger, and I also ran the clear command to clear everything. So what we need to do is we need to configure nginx. So I'm going to say sudo nano, which will open up an editor, and we're going to create a file here in etc nginx sites available, and then the name of our app. So I will just call this cool-app.config or just conf. And this will open up an editor here, and we need to paste a code snippet here. And you can find it in the description as well. I made it as easy as possible for you to deploy to a VPS. Okay, so I just pasted this code snippet, and what we're doing here is basically saying on our VPS, when you go to that root, and so just the home page, internally it should route that to localhost colon 3000, because this is where our Next.js app will be running. Okay, so then I can edit exit mode here. I will save it, yes. And I will press enter here. So just to check if that worked, I'm going to say ls and then give me everything in sites available. And we now see a configuration file for a cool app, configuration for nginx. So we can do a symbolic link. So here we can use cool-app.conf, and then we need to use, instead of sites available, we need to use sites enabled. All right, so if we do this, now I also want to see what's in this sites enabled path. So we can just copy that and just check ls. And now we can see we have added our cool app configuration. So now we're going to create a directory for our application. And for nginx, it needs to be a specific path. So in var www, and then we can give it a name. I will also call it cool-app. And then we want to go into that directory. So right now we're still on the root. So I'm going to change the directory into that path. All right, so now we're here. I can say ls and it's currently empty. So now what we're going to do is we're going to clone our repo from GitHub into this directory here. So on GitHub, on your repo, what you can do is you can go to code, and then here you get a URL. You can just copy that. And then here what we can say is git clone, and you can just paste that address. All right, so I'm going to press enter here, and you can see it's cloning into there. And now when I say ls, we can see that there is another folder here. So let's actually change directory into there. So we say cool app. All right, so now I'm going to do ls again, and you can see all of our files and folders are in here. Now our application also needs the node modules, and since this is a big folder, this is usually not included in your git. So how do we know which packages we need to install? Well, that's going to be defined in package.json, and the only thing we have to do is actually just write npm install, and npm will look into package.json to know what to install. All right, now when I ran npm install, I got an error, and the way to solve that is simply to exit the SSH and to simply log back in again. So if you want to exit it, you can just press exit, press enter, and then you can do SSH root at and then log in again. Now after logging in, you need to make sure you go to this path, right? So what you can do is you can change directory directly to this path again, right? So var www, and then we have cool app, which is just the name of the folder. So then you can try running npm install again. In case you got that error, it should work, right? So now the packages should be installed. So now we can run a production build, right? So this is going to be an optimized version of our application. So we can just say npm run build, and you can see it even sets up a SQLite database, all part of the same app, which is pretty cool. We don't have a separate external database. It all works within the app. All right, so at some point you can see the build succeeded and we can see some information about our routes. Now I just ran a clear command to clear everything, and since we changed the Nginx configuration, you want to restart Nginx so that it can pick up the new configuration. So you do that with sudo service nginx restart, and then your Nginx configuration should work. And now we want to run that production build. So you can just say npm run start, and that will spin up a server here, and that's going to be on localhost 3000. So now we want to check it out in the browser. Now before you type in localhost 3000, remember that's on the VPS, and the address of the VPS is actually this IP address. So we have to use that IP address, and you can just paste that right here, and you can see our application right now is live on the internet. We have successfully deployed a Next.js app to a VPS, and you can see everything is working. I can click around and everything here is working. All right, so maybe Hostinger is something that you want to consider for hosting your Next.js apps. All right, so that was a lot to take in. If you're a little bit confused right now, that's completely normal. Thanks for watching this video. Hope you learned something, and have a nice day. Bye.